Last week, I spoke about the way in which familial patterns reiterate throughout the generations if we do not address them, face them, and choose to either do away with them or turn them into blessings. The character of Isaac is the ultimate embodiment of this truth, as he really does nothing new. He follows directly in the footsteps of his father, quite literally repeating his actions and mistakes. Jacob, on the other hand, has a very different experience. In this week's Torah portion, we begin with Jacob making the journey from his home to visit his family in Haran in order to find a wife. On his way, he comes across a place that calls to him from across the generations. Our tradition teaches us that this place, which Jacob calls Bethel, is precisely the place that God showed Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. In this place, Abraham's covenant with God was sealed once again, while Isaac's covenant with God was started. It may be that, in fact, Jacob knew exactly what this place was. Later in the story, he refers to God as Pachad Yitzchak, the fear of Isaac, which is a reference to God's terrible command to Abraham. But in this place, at this time, Jacob decides to sleep. Jacob, as we've known him so far, is a tender soul. He's mild and he likes his comfort. He stays home. He cooks. He prefers his mother. Here, we have a Jacob far out of his comfort zone. He has been forced from his home, sent away by his mother, and it's getting dark. So he grabs a stone to use as a pillow. One can only imagine his fear sleeping outside in a strange place, but our sages connect this to something important. They say that not only was this the place of the binding of Isaac, but that the stone Jacob picked to lay his head upon was the very stone upon which Abraham bound Isaac. And here, on this stone, Jacob has his famous dream, in which he sees messengers of God ascending and descending from heaven on a ladder or perhaps a staircase. And here, God reiterates the covenant that was struck with Abraham and was continued with Isaac on Abraham's behalf. But Jacob responds completely differently than Abraham or Isaac. When Jacob awakens in the morning from this revelatory dream, he takes the stone he was sleeping upon, sets it upright as a pillar, and anoints it with oil. He then makes a vow, saying, "If God remains with me and protects me on this journey that I am making, and gives me bread to eat and clothing to wear, and if I return safe to my father's house, Adonai shall be my God. And this stone which I have set up as a pillar shall be God's abode. And of all that you give me, I will set aside as tithe for you." Jacob is responding to God's blessing word for word by affirming both of their roles in this covenant. In order for Jacob to be the extension of Abraham's blessing, God must also live up to God's side of the deal. And here's the crux of Jacob's journey up to this point. If we view this moment in Jacob's story as inexorably tied to the binding of Isaac, both by location, by the stone, and by his direct contact with God, we find here a new beginning for Jacob. No longer is he bound to the past of his father's trauma and his grandfather's overzealousness, but instead, he's able to, on his own terms, reestablish the covenant with God. He does so in two ways, by setting up the stone pillar and by reiterating in his own words the covenant God spoke. No longer is he bound to the past by the actions of those who came before him, but instead, he he is beginning to chart a future of his own accord in partnership with God. A future that, as God's blessing tells us, will bless the world. This moment connects the founding of our people Israel through an unending stream of covenant. By traveling to this particular physical space, Jacob transcends time and even individuality, seeing that he is, in a certain way, one and the same as Abraham. Further, this moment not only connects Jacob directly and indelibly to the past, but brings him to the future. We learn from the rabbis that Jacob's dream of angels ascending and descending is none other than a full vision of the revelation of the Torah at Sinai, which happens hundreds of years after Jacob's death. And even further, we learn that Jacob's involvement with this space ends up making it the site of the first and second temples, as well as the future third temple during the Messianic era, all of which happened thousands of years after Jacob's life. This moment in the Torah, when we combine all of the divine breakthroughs it encompasses, is like a hole punched into a piece of folded paper, uniting all of these separate instances of revelation in this one place, the place, Hamakom, another name for God. Our Midrash even hints at this as it teaches that even though each of these events took place in totally separate geographic locations, God folded space together to make them all present in this one place for Jacob. And why Jacob? And why now? We know that another major turning point happens for him and us as a people a few chapters later when he wrestles an angel and is given the name Israel. The secret to this, I believe, lies in the stone. As I said before, Jacob is a man of comfort, and he uses a stone for his pillow. In this act, he accepts a new life. No longer is he dwelling in tents, comforted by a kitchen in his mother's presence. He doesn't roll up a garment as his pillow, or even just uses his arm. He uses a stone, a symbol of hardness, of roughness, a symbol of his father's greatest trauma, the exact opposite of comfort. And this stone, too, becomes a symbol of God for him, as he anoints it after his dream, permanently sanctifying this folded place in our tradition. His willingness to set aside his preferences and his comforts, to accept the world as he'd been given it, and to work from there, was the culminating moment that allowed him to redeem his ancestors, Isaac and Abraham, by turning this stone of torment for his father into a place of blessing for himself. It freed him from the trappings of the past and allowed him to reestablish the divine covenant on his terms, in his words. And in this, he sets an example for us all. May each of us find ourselves able to accept and face the troubles of our world just as they are, with their hardness and their difficulties, as moments prepared for divine revelation, pushing us to live beyond our comfort zone. May we see our trials and difficulties as new chances for redemption, for us, for our ancestors, and for those yet to come. And may we see that any place we experience the divine is that place, folded over, connecting us all together through space and time, to all Yisrael, all who struggle with God. Shabbat Shalom.